When I finally finished writing my book, I still hadn't settled on the appropriate title for this book, and then it hit me, and how clever was this? Subversive Sequels in the Bible, How Biblical Stories Mine and Undermine Each Other. Now, during the course of this little talk, I will explain what a subversive sequel is, and I will try to impress upon you just how clever the mining and undermining subtitle is. But my son, who was 17 at the time, was not so impressed. He listened to my proposed title, he pretended to seriously consider it, and then he said with calm yet absolute authority, Ima, no one is going to read a book with that title. You're going to have to call it Monkeys in Space. Needless to say, I went with my own title, and the results have been okay, but every once in a while, I wonder what a better title might have done for me. Which brings me to my newest effort to explain what I do, and to the title of this little talk, which is Literary Friction, How Biblical Stories Converse and Collide with One Another. So with this title, I finally managed to insert a little bit of drama, maybe not as much as you'd find with these space-bound monkeys, but at the very least, we've got some violently clashing texts. So what do all these titles really mean? I'm hoping to reveal for you a vibrant, often turbulent conversation that is constantly taking place between the Bible's parts. And I want to demonstrate how that conversation provides a key to reaching profound meaning in the biblical text. And by the way, for those of you who are curious, I ran this new title past my son, and his response was unchanged. He said he'll wait. Anyway, to illustrate how stories converse with one another, let's pay a short visit to the tent of Sarah and Abraham. There's the tent. Husband and wife are each in their assigned spaces. He's at the doorway to the tent, ready to interact with the outside world, and she is in the recesses of her tent. The tent, after all, plays a central role in the story of all the matriarchs. That's where they live, that's where they're expected to remain. When three godly visitors arrive at the door, Sarah strains to overhear the miraculous news that these men deliver to Abraham. Next year at this time, Abraham and Sarah, at 100 years old and 90 years old respectively, will be the proud parents of a son. At this point, Sarah laughs to herself at the prospect, and the text reminds us that her laughter has good cause. After all, Chadal lihiyot lisara orach kanashim, which literally means Sarah had ceased having the paths of women, and which really means Sarah is long past menopause. The idiom of cut off paths offers us a powerful image. If she can't have a child, Sarah sees herself as a person whose paths in life have been sealed off. Without a functioning womb, her very purpose remains in question, and tragically, she is left a woman without options. As we exit the story of Sarah, we keep in mind two of its outstanding images: the tent, which defines and circumscribes, and the sealed paths, her sense that without the ability to conceive, her life choices have been seriously obstructed. So viewed in isolation, this story might suggest that a woman's place in the Bible is entirely internal and is entirely womb-centered. But now it's time to expand the conversation. If we follow the literary lead of the story of Sarah, and particularly the two images that we've highlighted, we arrive at another story that's in conversation with it. Surprisingly, the new story is one of a bold heroine in the book of Judges, a woman named Yael. Now, Yael, as we recall, is the woman who killed the enemy general Sisera by pounding a tent pin into his skull. As we would say in Israel, lo na'im. Yael is praised by Deborah, the reigning judge of the time, and a highly unusual biblical woman in her own right. And here's what Deborah says, in the days of Yael, chadelu arachot, paths ceased. There's our term again, a term that is so rare that it's used only twice in all of the Bible, in the story of Sarah and in the story of Yael. But this time, the term is used with artfully subversive intent. By referencing Sarah's hopelessness, Deborah hints that sometimes the paths of people, and women in particular, appear to be closed off. But then Deborah turns the thought on its head, as she adds, but there are always circuitous, alternative paths, dirachim akalkalot, fortuitous detours, if you will, that lead to triumph. In the case of Deborah and Yael, the traditional feminine path of childbirth is not even mentioned. Instead, we find Yael, the political assassin, and Deborah, the prophet, the judge, and the military leader. Alternative paths indeed. The next term to be subjected to subversive treatment is the word ohel, tent. As we've seen, the tent is the natural home of Sarah and of all the matriarchs. The tent makes a comeback in the story of Yael, but again, the borrowed term is turned on its head. Yael's chosen murder weapon is the tent pin, that little piece of hardware whose removal causes tents to come crashing down. When Yael assassinates the enemy general with her tent pin, she symbolically brings down all of our preconceptions about biblical women and our assumptions that their lives must revolve exclusively around matters of the tent. Two stories, the story of Sarah and the story of Yael, offer up sealed paths and tents. And that's how we know they're supposed to be read together as a pair. But once we draw them together, we notice that one story borrows from the other only to challenge its assumptions in the most radical ways possible. The tent-dwelling woman of Genesis is all but unrecognizable in the story of Yael. Now, let me be clear. My goal here is not to talk about the empowerment of biblical women, although I'm not altogether averse to talking about that, but not now. It's to demonstrate a particular method of Bible study. The method is all about reading stories in light of their parallels and allowing the comparisons to tell us how stories mine and undermine, converse, and collide with each other. When we read with this level of awareness and sensitivity, we end up deepening and broadening our understanding of the Bible's treatment of any number of topics and issues. In the specific case of Sarah and of Yael, the parallel sets up what I would say the outer boundaries of the Bible's view of its women, while hinting that everything in between is possible as well. At the same time, it cautions against drawing limited and simplistic conclusions about biblical women based on reading stories in isolation. But to fully parse out the method, we need to back up to pre-collision conditions. When approaching any piece of biblical text, no matter how many times we've seen it before, we begin by doing something very basic and which seems obvious, but which sadly is often overlooked in Bible study. We read carefully. As I learned from my teacher, Nechama Leibovitz, and as I've been instructing my students at Pardes for over 2 decades, and as I've taught in my many visits to Mechon Hadar, whenever we approach the text, it's best to do so with eyes that are as fresh and as unbiased as possible. What we look for in the text are its artfully problematic details, superfluous words, gaps in the text, ambiguities, all kinds of curiosities that get us to slow down and ask why. Why is the text written this way when we would have expected it to be otherwise? If we stop trying to smooth out difficulties and learn to embrace them instead, our close readings will yield great results. I'm always amazed at how well relative beginners take to this process, despite coming in with limited background in Bible study and limited language skills, although skills are undoubtedly an asset and are most definitely worth acquiring. Don't get me wrong. What I have found is that time after time, when they set their minds to it, people of all levels anticipate most of the problems and most of the solutions to be found in the classical commentaries. For an example of a textual difficulty, let's look at the Bible's very first word, and there we find our very first problem. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. What could be wrong with that? We all know it means, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, right? Well, not exactly, right? Strictly translated, the verse means, in the beginning of, God created. But in the beginning of what? So in identifying the problem, we open up a fundamental question about the Bible's opening chapter. Is it meant to be a cosmology? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and this is how? Or perhaps the unusual word bereshit, in the beginning of, requires a homiletic reading and really is meant to be a statement of theology. In the eyes of the Midrash, reshit is actually code for Torah, and so the world was created for the sake of Torah. Bereshit bara Elohim. What I'm trying to convey here is that all interpretation begins with exposing the text's problems, and only then, after our close and painstaking reading, are we in a position to tune in to the grand conversation that takes place between biblical stories, the mining and undermining of one story by another. And now for a warning and a confession. The results of reading stories in light of their parallels are astounding and exhilarating, but they can be addictive. and they can lead to the dreaded condition known in the trade as parallelomania. In fact, to be perfectly honest, for me, things have gotten so bad that I can no longer look at a biblical passage without hearing echoes of others. For instance, when I think of the story of Noah, my mind immediately jumps to the story's parallel, the book of Jonah, and I can't help but wonder, why do these stories have so many similarities? Water, boats, a threatened population that is sinful, a 40-day time period that leads up to the destruction, a Yonah in both stories. Why? Why do they both spotlight livestock in such a prominent manner? I'm here today not to answer these questions, but to invite you to do several things. First, I invite you to hear the conversation and to join it, to start noticing the Bible's intricate and insistent system of cross-referencing, and then to use it as a means to understand more about the text. Next, once you're tuned into the conversation, I invite you to hear the subversive tone that conversation often takes. The potential payoff of this kind of reading is an appreciation of the breadth and the depth of the Bible's scope when addressing matters of critical importance to its readers. In the example that we've seen together, we note how the story of Yael subversively rewrites the story of Sarah, and as a result, we're called upon to revisit and to reconsider our assumptions about women's roles in the Bible. Before I invite you to do one last thing, I want to be clear about what I'm not asking you to do. I am not asking you to spectate or audit while I or other so-called experts entertain and enlighten you as to the text's true meaning. I do, however, invite you to roll up your sleeves, open your minds, pose all your difficulties, and begin to look for resolutions that emerge from the text itself. Bible study is meant to be a dynamic, interactive, hands-on journey of discovery, which reflects the dynamic nature of the book itself. That dynamic nature is highlighted when we add the extra layer of intertextual study, and even more when we search for the inverse parallels offered by the text's subversive sequels. To my mind, a biblical text that questions its own assumptions and often reverses its own conclusions is a text that remains timeless and timelessly relevant. As Rashi comments on the arrival of the Israelite nation at Sinai and the unusual phrase, Bayom hazeh ba'u midbar Sinai, on this day they arrived at the desert of Sinai, instead of the more expected Bayom hahu, on that day. Very loosely translated, Rashi's resolution of the problem and his message to his readers is this: each day, students of the Bible should be moved to say, I have just now received this freshly minted document. It is addressed directly to me, to my life, and to its complex, ever-changing circumstances. It is my hope and belief that when we hear the dynamic conversation that is taking place between biblical texts, we are better able to enter that conversation as active participants. The conversation with our foundational book, this one, rendered fresh and new every day in study halls such as this one, is a conversation that is well worth joining.